Now, Tom Kohler is, of course, what we would call a Savannah legend or a living legend. You know, when you come to Savannah, you always hear about the famous and interesting individuals. Many of them have passed on, but there's so many today, and he is certainly one of them. He's a native of Savannah, lived almost his entire life here, graduated from school here from Herschel Jenkins, went to Armstrong. He did spend some time at University of Georgia, that I believe was the only time he's lived out of town. He's been involved with people with disabilities for a very long time. He grew up at this synagogue. And of course, he's been the coordinator of the Chatham Savannah Citizen Advocacy, and also the founder. He has been on boards of every imagine from Forsyth Farmers Markets. He's been interviewed by everyone. He's been called a gatekeeper by different organizations, including Origin Savannah. He's been named Best Community Activist, Best Liberal, and Best Savannian many times. And so we're such a privilege to have him here. And we're going to talk a little bit about his life and what he's done, because as you know, we're trying to do more social advocacy in our synagogue. And it's a little hard right now because of what's going on, but we're trying to do more and more. So welcome, Tom, as we go. If you hear that sound, I'll just invite people to come on. And then as again, we'll invite everybody to stay mute instead of Tom. We are on YouTube. So Tom, welcome to you. We're so thrilled to have you.
No, thank you. Great opportunity.
And we are gonna play this. This is live on YouTube. So anybody who want to watch it later, as with our other classes, a lot of people watch it later as opposed to on. So we're gonna invite first Tom just to tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what led you to becoming what you are today.
All right. Well, that's very kind. Well, as you said, I was born and sort of barely bred here in Savannah, Georgia. I was born on Siler Avenue near Waters, and we moved to Barn Drive when I was about 5 years old. I'm a public school kid, Heard Wilder Jenkins, graduating in 1970. Mick Israel kid. My younger brother and I had perfect attendance for several years. I was a fond memory I have with Mick Israel of many. The fond memory is, I think, the first year we had perfect attendance, we got a prayer book for, like, you know, the award. The second year, I think we got a hymn book. The third year, I think we got a Bible. And then the fourth year, they asked what, they kind of run out of gifts, and they asked what I might want. And I said a 3-wood. And sure enough, I got a 3-wood for perfect attendance. And so that's a great memory for me of Mick Israel. And also just to say that an awful lot of sort of my leanings, shall we say, came from Mick Israel. You know, there were tumultuous times. I graduated from high school in 1970. And so there were tumultuous times in the 60s. And a lot of the way I sort of came to look at the world was, of course, through my family, and also, again, through Mick Israel. I would also say that my great love of downtown Savannah started because we would come to synagogue every weekend, every week. And Monterey Square was beautiful to me always. And it was also obviously the place that you got to escape synagogue. You know, when the service was over, you ran, and, you know, back in that day, if you could jump from the top stair all the way down and then into the park, that was your liberation. But my my attraction to downtown Savannah, certainly because of Mick Israel. Many families that we knew in the suburbs at the time never came downtown. And I was fortunate to always consider downtown to be really, you know, kind of the real Savannah. Let me think how far to go. So I would also say,
I'm just going to say first, I know you were not one of those kids who left services early and skipped out of Sunday school or services. You always waited till it was over. I know that.
That would be right. I'll concede that point. The other thing I would say is that my sort of career began because of being in the Temple Youth Group at Mick Israel Temple. We were asked to go visit a youngster who needed some help, some physical therapy help at his home, and Donald Price was the president of TYG. I was the vice president. And we went to visit a young man named Tom Broussard at his home. And a couple of TYGers got involved. I stayed involved for, I think, a couple of years, which is a long time when you're a teenager. And would go every week and help do some physical therapy patterning with Tommy in his home. Just to briefly talk about that for a minute, it took 4 volunteers to do the patterning, and it was 2 patterns a day. So that's 8 volunteers a day, 350 days a year to do this physical therapy patterning. The volunteers were coordinated by a volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Broussard's next door neighbor, Louise Wilkins. And Ms. Wilkins happened to be the secretary for Joel Williams, who was the in-house attorney for Savannah Foods. And so Mr. Williams was usually in DC keeping an eye on the sugar subsidies. And his secretary, while the cat was away, Ms. Wilkins was at play arranging for 8 volunteers a day, 7 days a week for young Tom Broussard. So in hindsight, a couple of things I learned. You know, I got to meet young Tom Broussard individually as a human being, someone that lived inside a family that would do absolutely anything for the best interest of their own son. Many people in, quote, the field of disability tend to meet people with disabilities in a group, you know, a classroom or some big group setting. I had that wonderful experience to, you know, meet Tommy very personally in that way. And again, surrounded by this very, very determined family. You know, and the other thing subconsciously I learned was that people were willing to be helpful because everybody that was there voluntarily and was happy to do it. I tended to also be the youngest person there every time. The other volunteers would always be women, almost always married women, almost always married women with children. And when we took our little 20-minute break in between the patterns, I would disappear into an easy chair and just listen. And, you know, when you're 16 years old, it's pretty interesting to hear what 4 married women talk about. And, you know, it's husbands, children, money, and sex. And so I got a pretty interesting education 20 minutes at a time in that easy chair there.
And it sounds amazing that you started this so young. For those who are wondering, TYG is Temple Youth Group. So started it as a youth group person. And of course, now we're learning that that probably was one of the reasons you ended up doing what you did in life, was this first experience with this kid.
Absolutely. You know, my sense of myself at that time was that I would move and go to New York City and work in the advertising industry. My uncle Harold owned an advertising firm, and although we were not close, you know, I knew he was out there, and that was, again, just my sense of myself in that time. But once I got connected with Tommy Broussard, and that just, you know, I went down a different path. Partly, I think it was because when you're 15, 16 years old, you know, when you want to act like an adult, when you want to act like a grown-up, your parents tell you that you're not a grown-up yet. And when you want to act like a child, they tell you to grow up. You know, there's that time that you just can't quite get it right. But whenever I went to Miss Tommy Broussard's house and volunteered there every week, you know, my role was clear. I was clearly part of the team, and I was treated with respect in that way. So I think that was the other part of it. I was, you know, just to be doing something that mattered in such a repetitive way and in such a small group, you know, again, just made it was easy for that to become important to me. I'll say it that way.
Well, I think it goes to show that, you know, modeling is essential. We know we're supposed to model behavior for our kids, but we also know that when you're 16 and other adults model for you, it can be just as important, sometimes in the moment even more so, because they're showing you how to behave as a good human being, as an adult human being. So it's nice to know that you found this type of modeling in our community. Not surprising, but nice. What's kind of been the highlights of your work so far through the years?
Well, many. I guess the one thing I would say is, I had a very interesting job, and that was to find the absolute best people I could and pull them into the story. And in most businesses or whatever, you're just really trying to find somebody. I mean, if you're in sales, all the person needs to do is have some money and want your product. But I was being asked to find the absolute best people I could and bring them onto this journey, shall we say. So that was one highlight.
Could you explain what you mean
Um,
the best people and explain what they were for?
yes. W.W. Law once explained this to me in this way. And, Mr. Law was a wonderful, although difficult teacher. And he said to me one day, his voice was even gravelier than mine is now. And Mr. Law said, Mr. Kohler, you're looking for people who have compassion and backbone. You'll find some that have one, some that have the other. You'll find some that have neither. But Mr. Kohler, you're looking for people with compassion and backbone. And so that, in terms of sort of a street definition, that's been the best definition that I've ever heard. That I was looking for people with compassion and backbone. I was looking for people that were pro-social, people that were proactive, people that had had the experience of being able to challenge assumptions and speak truth to power at some point in their lives. And then I was inviting those people one at a time to align themselves personally and directly with someone who lived on what we called thin ice because of having a developmental disability. So I matched people up, one person that lived on what we call thick ice with one person who lived on thin ice, asked people to consider staying involved with one another over long periods of time, maybe lifetimes, and then offered moral support and informational support to those folks that were matched up together. And many of the people that got matched really did form true relationships. And I think Linda Whittish is now the person who's been in her citizen advocacy match the longest, and I think she's been matched now for 40 years. So that was the nature of the work.
Well, that's, 40 years, that's that's incredible dedication. Can you tell us a little bit about, we know you talked about young Broussard, but how this led you to help found this organization that's still around today?
Yes. I went to Armstrong and for a couple of years, and then dropped out because I wanted to do something in the field of disability, and they didn't have any classwork out there that really matched my interest. So I dropped out and worked at what was then called the Kicklighter School without a college degree, but I taught there. I made $4,200 a year, which was the pay there at that time. I lived downtown on Gordon Street in the 200 East block in a 3-story townhouse that cost $50 a month. There were 4 of us that lived there, so we paid $12.50 a month rent in downtown Savannah at that time. I then transferred up to the University of Georgia to finish up an undergraduate degree. I worked in the first group home in the state, and then returned to Savannah and went back to work at the Association for Retarded Citizens to use the language of the day. I did that for a while. At that time, though, I ran into some people who had a different way of looking at things that I'd been taught. I had been taught that people with disabilities were sort of broken people, and that our job was to fix them. And certainly that was part of the assumption around Tommy Broussard, that we could somehow fix him physically. But I ran into some people in my early 20s that had a little bit different perspective. And they said, if you think about people with disabilities the same way we think about any other minority group that's devalued by the larger culture. And once I was able to look at the world through that lens, my interest became more radicalized. And what I thought needed to be done didn't match the interest of the organization. And so I left and went to work for the Mental Health Center. One of 23 people around the state, the first effort to bring people back out of the big state institutions in the mid-70s. It was pretty clear pretty quickly that the state had no real interest in that this was window dressing. And so I was frustrated with that. At that point, I thought I would probably step out and just go into private business locally. But then a Jewish woman got off of an airplane in Savannah. I had been sent to go pick her up at the airport because, Kohler can go do the scut work. Went and picked up Roberta Malavinda, was from New York. She was working in Atlanta and organizing a new idea called citizen advocacy in the state. And Roberta was the most radical Jewish person I'd ever met, and in some ways, the most efficient, pragmatic person I'd ever met. And so, after a couple of days showing her around town and just watching her work with people and watching her tell the story of possibility that she saw in citizen advocacy, I was attracted to the job and was lucky to get the job. We thought it would last 3 years, 5 years, and then that would be about it. It was an experiment. 40 years in, it turned out in Savannah, Georgia, it was more than an experiment. It was something that people here embraced, and we built an organization and raised money and have always had good boards and that sort of thing. So that's sort of how that journey began. I've said in the past, and I think it's true, I am basically an over-caffeinated barfly. I am not an academic in any way. Most of what I learn from other people. And most of the way I've learned that, and this goes back deep into my life, most of the way I've learned that is through conversation and through being present with people. And so that's really the particular work I did with citizen advocacy, that was what was called for. And I happened to like to do that and was good at that. So 6 appointments a day in six different parts of Savannah would be a good day for me. And I had day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year of that kind of opportunity to be out and about and meet people and listen to people across all different walks and wheels of life here, and hear stories and look for commonalities and build connections and encourage people to question and challenge and change the status quo as it affected individual people.
Well, I will argue with you about the academic parts, because you definitely could be with the mind you have, but we also know that if you go to Sentient Bean or you go anywhere else, that you're always meeting with people and just talking with everybody, learning what's going on, and you're just pretty much everywhere, like I say, kind of like the wind. But as we have people here, if you have any questions, please just chime in. But I want to know, because again, I moved here 8 years ago, and obviously your organization was already here. What was it like to start these type of organization in the 70s and 80s? What were kind of the issues that you faced?
Right. In the mid 70s, with regard to people with disabilities anyway, not much had changed post World War II until the late 50s. And in the late 50s, the GIs that had come home from the war and started having babies realized that their sons and daughters that had disabilities weren't being welcomed into public schools. And so the Association for Retarded Citizens movement started in the 50s. And so the 20 years from the late 50s to the late 70s was a period of real change and growth in the world and field of disability. Rabbi, if you don't mind, just reframe that question for me.
Sure.
Sorry.
What were the things that really stood in your way?
Yeah.
What things did you have to overcome?
So one thing, the first thing was that we really had no idea if people would say yes. I mean, just pure and simple. Would anybody say yes to the invitation we were offering? That was an open question for sure. To see a voluntary personal relationship, aligning oneself with the interests of one other person for a long time. We had the invitation to be answered. So that was for us one issue. Another issue was the difference in legislation, the difference in what people can be, quote, made to do and what people are willing to do. And we had some sense that you couldn't legislate kind of change was really needed. And we had seen that in a couple ways with regard to the deinstitutionalization movement. For example, workforce, the little Brook Institute in New York that Geraldo Rivera broke that story. Tremendous legislative change, billions of dollars thrown at that. But our feeling was that until people's hearts could change, really, it was very difficult to create change at a level of values and hearts. It was from the top down. And so we actually got a fair amount of flack because people wanted us to be suing people and using a different type of advocacy. Our intent was always to work at heart level and at the humanity level. Another issue, quite frankly, was nobody had ever imagined a human service organization that would, for example, have its office in the nicest building in Chatham County. There's sort of an assumption somehow that the nonprofit world.
Rabbi, excuse me 1 second. Is there a way you might improve the sound that's coming in? I don't know, maybe it's my speaker, but I don't know if everybody else, it's coming in very garbled. It's very difficult to understand Tom.
All right, Tom, would you start over again with this last thing?
Yeah, if maybe his speaker is connected to something else, because I do get some background.
It came in and out. Would you just start just that last part over again? See if it works.
Yeah. Okay. All I'll say is speaker wise, I'm not connected to anything else, and
now it's coming in fine. Now it's coming in
Okay.
fine again.
Right. All right, great. Well, just to say that part of what we were up against, if you will, was that we didn't have any idea if people would actually say yes to the invitation of becoming involved with an individual person over long periods of time. In this community, the idea that an organization that was interested in people with disabilities would actually want an office and wind up with a physical office space in the Savannah building was unheard of. We were supposed to be in the United Way building. We were supposed to be, with the human service structure, but we instinctively and was taught, our real challenge is need, well-connected, highly valued private citizens and bring them into the story. And you'll find those people in Johnson Square. And so that's where the office will be. And so there were some things like that that were really interesting to sort through in the beginning.